Hi, everyone. I am Mary Lynn Suchan, a producer of Catalyst Content, and I want to thank you today for joining us. I will be behind the scenes today, so put all of your questions in the comments area and I'll gather them together because today's host is Charlie McCarron. So without further ado, take it away, Charlie.
Thanks, Mary Lynn. I'm excited to be here in this panel discussion on music in TV and film, and I'm joined by two amazing guests here. We have Ryan Elder, who's the composer behind Rick and Morty and lots of other fun animations like Harmonquest, Boss Baby, the Netflix series, and even The Simpsons you've contributed to. So I'm excited to talk to you, Ryan, about animation scores. And Robert Elhai has an amazing IMDb page, close to 200 films you've orchestrated, and including like some of the biggest ones out there: Marvel movies, Batman movies, Alien movies, Frida, which won an Oscar for Best Score. So, Robert, really excited to talk to you about orchestration. So first, though, I want to talk to Ryan a little about your process in composing for Rick and Morty. So, Ryan, let's watch a clip from the intro of a show. And anything you want to set this up with?
No, this is just like I cut this together. It's like a little action scene that goes into the main title theme.
So. All right. So I will pull that up. So great. So, Ryan, tell us a little bit about how you got started working on Rick and Morty.
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep it as short as possible, but it's all tied together, right? Like you got to start kind of at the beginning. After college, I got an internship working on advertising music. Turned that into a career in advertising music, but sort of on the side of that, I became friends with Justin Roiland, Dan Harmon, and several other people involved in the Los Angeles like short film, short comedy series scene. And then Justin and Dan sold a show to Cartoon Network, Rick and Morty. They brought me on as a composer because we had a long history of working together on various short films and short comedy bits. And that's how that's the short version.
Sure. Yeah. So I think one thing that's really cool about Rick and Morty is not only are you composing the underscore, you're a lot of times doing songs for the show.
Yeah.
So yeah, how does that process work when you're collaborating with them?
You know, it varies depending on whether or not they have an idea for the song in the script already, like as is the case with a song I wrote that was kind of a Bowie homage called Goodbye Moon Men in season 2. Season 2? I think so. And that one had the lyrics in the script. So, and it said a Bowie style song. So I knew exactly what to do based on the script. Whereas sometimes, and we've done this a few times here in the back half of season 4, a lot of times the animators will cut together a montage sequence and they'll temp it with something. And, you know, the temp doesn't quite work or whatever. And so we'll create a new song that's specifically for that scene. On Sunday night, we had a scene that was like a camping montage. So Dan Harmon, the co-creator, and I got together, or virtually now, and came up with like a goofy 80s song about camping.
I just listened to that, actually. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun these days. Like, you have to be a little more flexible in terms of how you work on stuff. I think, pre-COVID-19, we would have had like a session with a vocal session, maybe some background singers, and done it up a little bigger. But now it's like, I send Dan the tracks. He has his home recording studio. He sends me back stuff. I clean it up, tune it up, do all the, fancy stuff to it and make it sound good. And then we go from there. But so it's interesting. It's actually, things move faster now because we don't have the flexibility of going to a studio and doing all the extras.
Yeah. So animation wise, I think people might be curious, how does it work? Are you writing the music beforehand sometimes and they animate to that? Or is it always done, animation's done and you write?
Yeah, I work to what's called an animatic. It's sort of like a simple, almost pencil drawing slideshow of the show itself set to what they call the radio play, which is the dialogue track. And so the animatic has mainly pretty close to the locked timings of the final episode, but it just comes out. It's available to me about 6 months before that color is available. And so I work to the animatic, which it's all post-scored to the animatic. I almost never write anything ahead of time. Maybe once in a while there'll be a song that I'll write ahead of time, but for the most part, I work to the animatic, and then about 3 to 6 months later, I get color. It's closer to the final timings, and I adjust to the final color.
Cool.
Yeah.
So something else that I think maybe Robert could chime in on too is, how much of the time are you using live instruments versus sampled instruments? Like, are you ever hiring an orchestra, or is it mostly samples and weird like sound effect style instruments?
Yeah, I'll say what I do. I know it's probably vastly different for Robert, but all the music that I write for Rick and Morty, or I would say about 99% of it, is what we call in the box, which is all within the computer using sample libraries. And they're extremely sophisticated. You can make things sound pretty realistic. A good trained ear, especially someone who's really familiar with orchestral music or film music, will be able to tell the difference. But for the most part, you can get pretty high quality orchestral recordings using samples. And then, ideally on some shows, you have the budget to hire a full orchestra and take those from the sample stage to the full orchestra stage, which is where Robert comes in. And we did do that for a live concert we put on in October 2018. And hopefully we'll get to do that more going forward. But the show itself, it's more of a budget issue and sometimes a time issue, that's just faster and cheaper to use the sample libraries.
Yeah. And Robert, what are you finding these days as an orchestrator, like instruments versus sampled instruments?
Yeah, I would say that I am never called upon to orchestrate something that is then realized with samples. I mean, I think some people, I would guess, do that, but all of the work that I have done has been, or all the opportunities I've had to orchestrate has been when there was an actual orchestra that was going to play it. And in fact, a lot of what my job is with the with media scores that like Rick and Morty is to take what a composer has orchestrated, and many composers, as you said, Ryan, that the sample libraries out there are amazingly sophisticated and realistic, and they create mock-ups that sound, I mean, they sound so good that directors have it. I think some directors have gotten to the point where they sign off on the mock-up, and then the orchestra is just sort of a, just making sure that real instruments play it instead of sampled instruments. But so my job is to translate what people write for samples, and sometimes it's a one-to-one correspondence. A composer will write a flute line, and I will, take that and put it into a notation program, and there you go. But sometimes I work with lots of composers that sketch things out orchestrally much more. That is to say that they'll often use a string patch and a brass patch, and they'll play some horn lines, and they'll play some trombone lines, and they'll sort of fill out the basic idea of what it's supposed to sound like, and then they leave it up to me or whomever to actually figure out what each instrument plays in order to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I when I'm scoring, I know, especially when I need to move quickly, I'll use.
So I'm curious.
I'll use ensemble patches, which don't translate well to orchestration because it's all the instruments in one MIDI channel. And so for an orchestrator to take that, they have to parse out, okay, the flute's up here, the trombones are down here, and it ends up getting, it makes your job a lot harder, I'm sure. But for where I'm working, I'm just like, I need to move fast. So let's get this in here,
Yes, no. And I would say that I would go so far as to say that composers who are writing for scores in the box, as opposed to composers that know that they are writing for eventually for an orchestra, tend to write differently. I think I actually very rarely, I'm surprised at how rarely I come across sample libraries like Project Sam, for example, or other kinds of orchestra phrase libraries, where I have to sort of figure out what, where you put down a key and you get a whole phrase.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and those are great for in the box because they sound much more realistic. You get the sound of an ensemble playing together, and it's much more it's much easier to create something that really sounds like an orchestra with those kinds of sample libraries. But at least the composers I've worked for have not been using them.
Yeah, and Ryan, I feel like, Ryan, you have the advantage in Rick and Morty that the world is like sort of sci-fi and synthetic to begin with.
Yeah.
So synthetic, there we go. So do you feel like that kind of covers up any of the, like if you're using a synthetic instrument, I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I do use a lot of synthesizer sounds and stuff that are, an orchestra couldn't play, but I do try to make it sound like a film score as much as I can, And if I had the time and we had the budget to do a full 80-piece orchestra for every episode, I would do it in a heartbeat. Of course, it's going to sound way better, going to sound more real, more exciting, all of those things. When we had the orchestra for the live concert we did, it was all the orchestrator that I worked with had to take my stuff that was written with Project Sam, as you mentioned, Robert, and stuff where it is phrase-based libraries, and turn that into notes on a page, which is, if I knew going in that it was all going to be for a live orchestra, I would absolutely write it differently. And I wouldn't care about making it sound real because the orchestra is going to make it sound real.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, to answer your question, really, I do try to make it sound as real as possible in the time, within the constraints that I have.
Yeah.
That's good. I'm curious if you've ever approached Cartoon Network with the possibility of having some live instrumentalists.
I haven't. I should. Just getting to do this live show was a dream come true to begin with. So maybe I should shoot higher. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and especially Simpsons is a great example of a show that's always been done with a live orchestra.
Yeah.
And it's basically because Matt Groening has a lot of power and insists on it.
Family Guy, all the Seth MacFarlane shows are all live orchestra as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's the same thing. It's there's somebody artistically involved who is just insists on it, and so they cough up the money. I'm sure they would love to not have to pay for a live orchestra for those series, but it would be it sounds so much better.
Yeah.
It's just
so Ryan, one thing I'm wondering too, what do you think about when you're planning out a whole series, like a whole season of a show? What are some considerations directors should be keeping in mind musically?
Yeah, one thing that we often do when we're starting a show from scratch or musically approaching a brand new show, if we're like working on the pilot or whatever. And I'm actually in this process right now with the show. It's a lot of experimenting. It's a lot of, the showrunner, the director, whoever is in charge creatively will usually pull a lot of examples of things that they like. For Rick and Morty, they pulled stuff from Farscape. Obviously, Doctor Who was referenced. Jerry Goldsmith's scores, Planet of the Apes, Alien, stuff like that got pulled, and that sort of became like almost like a playlist or whatever of references that I could go to and go, okay, this is kind of the world that they're thinking of being in. The show we're working on right now has like a more of a experimental hip hop kind of a thing. So they're pulling stuff from Captain Murphy and all these like crazy like experimental hip hop artists. And so that is informing the way that we're approaching this very first episode of the show. And so really what you want to do is just get as many things that feel like they're in the world of the show if you're the decision maker creatively. And then the composer can go, oh, I see where your head is at here. Let's take elements of these and sort of, figure out how they're going to work to tell the story that you're trying to tell.
Yeah. And like themes, how much are you thinking about like, this is the Rick theme or Morty theme in certain situations that you can bring back? Yeah.
Rick and Morty doesn't have a lot of character themes like that, but Boss Baby Back in Business has tons of character themes. There's a Boss Baby, whenever he's in charge, whenever he's got a plan, we often go to sort of a hip hop, like a jazzy hip hop vibe. Whenever things are going crazy, we'll do more of an orchestral thing. And a lot of characters, especially the villains of the season, will have like an instrument or a melody or both that sort of cue off what they are. And we usually, my co-composer, Ben Bromfield, and I usually try to find an instrument that we think speaks to that character. We used hammered dulcimer for this character in the very first season of the show because he had this sort of Machiavellian kind of twisted, almost like a Sherlock Holmes villain kind of a vibe to him. And so hammered dulcimer just spoke to that in kind of an evil, underhanded way. And then we used bass clarinet for one of the villains and stuff like that. And then there's usually a melody associated with them as well. So those things are important. Rick and Morty, I don't do that as much. I use the main theme, the melody, the main theme sometimes if there needs to be a heroic moment or something like that. The most recent episode, actually, when Rick takes off to fight the god, there's like a little heroic moment with the theme song. But for the most part, I'm sort of more setting the tone and telling the story than trying to introduce melodies.
Yeah.
Right. Setting the tone instead of guiding particular journeys of each character. Right.
Yeah. Well, here's a random question for both of you. How much do you think instrumentation versus underlying composition influences the viewer? Like if you were switching out like different instruments but same composition.
Oh, I see.
I love that question, actually. I've never really thought about it.
I don't know, it just popped in my head, but because
I've actually thought about it a lot, and I think it first of all, it depends on how much the music is allowed to be a part of the presentation. And the example I always turn to is John Williams' scores for Star Wars, because George Lucas established this sort of paradigm of this part of the storytelling is the music. It's not just the dialogue. It's not just what's happening. It's the music is telling the story, and so the music has a very large presence in those scores, and so I think when he does something subtle, relatively subtle, I think it makes an impact. And then I've also, but on the other extreme, there are lots of movies that are just buried in sound effects, and there's no point in subtlety at all. and in fact, many times I find the composer that sort of encouraging me to write it for the album, as they say. You know, they want it to be as great. They want it to be as good a piece of music as possible, even though that in the actual film, no one's going to hear it.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think actually instrumentation, you know, they're both very important. You know, what you're asking about is really like the importance of melody versus the importance of instrumentation. And I think, you know, I personally think instrumentation might be more important. It's hard to say. It depends on the situation, obviously. But, you know, we know what's wrong, right? Like, let's go to John Williams. Let's use The Force Awakens for an example, right? He uses flutes for Rey, and they're percussive and you know, have this sort of adventurous kind of a quality to them, mysterious too, because she's a new character. We don't know who she is. And then he uses trombones and French horns, but mainly trombones for Kylo Ren, that theme, which becomes a really important theme throughout the whole trilogy. And you know, trombones are great for getting power and you know, menace and all the things that we want to get from Kylo Ren. If you try to use flutes for Kylo Ren, it would not work. It just wouldn't. You could try, and that's one of the things as a composer that I often describe. Like when people ask me, you know, how do you do what you do? And it's like, well, I know what not to do first. So I just like remove all of that stuff. And then I'm left with like some options for what I should do. And I just pick between those, you know, like you don't put flutes on the bad guy unless he's sneaky and mysterious. And you're maybe if you're doing like a jazz score or something, but so yeah, I think personally instrumentation is probably a little more important than melody. Although if you had a fun, happy trombone melody for Kylo Ren, that would also be pretty bad too. So maybe they're part and parcel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think I would agree with that. I think that what makes the two themes in particular stand out is how they're orchestrated. And it's one of the ways that he manages to make the music fit the character. I mean, trombones are and it's a very sort of classical kind of thing. You know, the trombones ever since the time of Mozart have been used for death and menace.
Yeah.
So he's not only thinking in terms of what a trombone sounds like. He's thinking it's more about what the trombone means in our common culture.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, a vast majority of film music is based on the Western tradition of music and composing. So if Mozart or if Bach was using trombone, well, Bach probably didn't use a ton of trombones, but if Mozart was using trombones to get power and you know, drama, then we probably are too.
Right, exactly. And on the other hand, then you have something what you previously referred to as using a hammered dulcimer for a character. And I would say that there is not that if you hear a hammered dulcimer, you wouldn't necessarily think of a twisted, evil person. So that's sort of a kind of an interesting choice based on the combination of the sound with the character.
Mm-hmm.
The character is associated with that sound, and then you kind of make that association. But it's at the other hand, it's a very uncliched, you know, creative choice, I think.
Thank you.
I think this is a good segue to Robert talking about like what you do a little more. And I'd like to show your clip. And could you set this up for us a little bit? The Interview with a Vampire clip.
Yes, this is from Interview with a Vampire from 1994. So a long time ago. But it was, and what you are going to see is the soundtrack dubbed onto a video cassette of the film, that we worked with as a you know, when we were scoring a film, we basically had a rough video of it. It was mostly done. I would say there was very. What you'll see is very close in terms of the effects and all of that. It's the scene when New Orleans is burning, if anybody sort of remembers that movie. about halfway through. And what you're not going to hear, so there are two couple things to point out. One is that you'll see a kind of a bad dub of, you know, it won't be it's not high res video, and at the same time you'll see streamers which were put in by the software that we use, Digital Performer, to, you know, to show when different things happen, you know, cut to running or whatever. The other thing I wanted to point out is I wanted everybody to see this scene without the sound effects and without dialogue. There's very little dialogue in this scene, actually. Just a little bit at the end, and you'll tell when a close-up on, you'll see a close-up on the character who is speaking, and it'll be clear that he's speaking, and the music gets soft. But before that, it's all just sound effects. And I really wanted to illustrate how amazing it would be if they scored a film with an orchestra and didn't have any sound effects, and just allowed the music to create the horror of what you're watching.
Yeah. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Great score.
Yeah.
I
So-
I was very happy how that turned out.
Yeah.
Great score.
So that was a collaboration with Elliot Goldenthal.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about like your relationship with the composer and how you work together.
Well, I would say I think I'm a little unusual in that respect, because I tend to base all of my relationships with composers on my relationship with Elliot. And my relationship with Elliot, who was the first composer I started working with in the film, is very collaborative. It started off. I started off as a sort of a transcriber, or to use a really technical term, an amanuensis, which is somebody who basically writes down what the composer plays, so the composer doesn't have to bother with it themselves. And eventually, as we worked together, there would be sort of shorthand things. He would say to me, "Remember what we did back in that other score? We'll do that again." And then he wouldn't even bother necessarily to put it in the mock-up. just describe what it should be, and so I could, realize it. And just over the years, we developed a sort of a shorthand, where he would describe. Sometimes he often referred to classical scores, and so we had that language in common. I mean, obviously, Mahler, Shostakovich, Prokofiev, and Stravinsky are all very, present in his scores, and so he would refer to those composers, and then that gave us a common language, a lot like what you were talking about, Ryan, when they would play a hip hop song, so you had a sense of what's in their head. And then it's a matter, and orchestration really is realizing what is in a composer's head, I think. I often compare it to a draftsman writing out plans for a building, and the architect has this design for a building, but the architect doesn't necessarily figure out where every beam should go in order for it to be structurally stable. That's sort of the job of the draftsman, to figure out those little details. But ultimately, what is presented is the composer's vision. And so I've always approached orchestration. I mean, I'm a composer myself, and I've had done a lot of composing, and I've trained as a composer, and so I have a sense of how to get inside a composer's mind and sort of translate what they want into what actually has to be on the page in order for it to sound like what it is.
Yeah. So one thing that the directors and producers listening might be wondering is, what are some things they should be thinking about if they do want to hire an orchestra and composer, orchestrator, everything? What are some things to think about when they have a budget like that?
Well, I think first thing to think about is whether it is whether to use an orchestra at all, whether they have the budget or not. I mean, I might be hurting my future income here, but orchestras are not always an important part of. I mean, there are plenty of great scores that are realized without an orchestra, and even in the best, in the most common uses, when the orchestra is done in a big film score, the orchestra is often just layered with lots of electronics and percussion, and it's only one element. Which is a much different consideration than relying on the orchestra to provide every single bit of sound, which is the way that people like John Williams tend to write. And I think that kind of score is great for when it's appropriate, but I have equal admiration for someone like Hans Zimmer, who is sort of on the opposite end of the use of the orchestra, in that the orchestra is not required to, and often it's quite buried far down in the mix, but he always uses a live orchestra, and he always and he appreciates what that brings to the project. I think, there's just kind of no way to substitute for 90 people in a room all breathing and creating this thing together.
Yeah. If I could add on to that, I would say if you're a producer or a director or someone who's creating something and you are wondering if you should hire an orchestra, I would say the first person to ask is your composer. Your composer is going to tell you, yeah, we could really benefit from a live orchestra, or you know what, it's probably not super necessary. Even like you said, Hans Zimmer or Junkie XL, these composers that are using tons and tons of electronic elements, the orchestra is still an important part of their sound, and they, like you said, they're not going to want to do it without it. So if they signed on to a movie and the producers said you aren't allowed to use an orchestra, they'd probably still do it, but they might try to find a way to make the orchestra happen anyways.
Right.
How about
And
like a happy medium of a string quartet? How does that translate if you were going to hire just a few people to play live and supplement with other things? How about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I think that's actually done quite a bit. I think that many orchestra scores are enlivened by even just a few live players. You know, you can feel it. You know, you can feel it. Just adds a dimensionality and a breadth.
Yeah, when I used to work in advertising and we would do orchestral ads, occasionally we would only have budget to bring in 4 players or 3 sometimes, and we would bring them in and layer them in, and it just adds just one little tiny layer of realism on top of all the samples and stuff. It can really elevate a score in ways that you can't really describe ahead of time until you hear it.
It's true. And one of the
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing that you get when you add live instrumentalists is you get more music, you get more musical input. You get the input of the instrumentalists, which is incomparable. I mean, especially for a piece of music that has a lot of different instruments. Maybe like an orchestra. You know, when you have somebody who is trained on the flute and has played the flute for years and years and years, then the best sample in the world is never going to be able to substitute for the actual player.
Yeah,
playing, blowing into it and blowing into something like that.
Yeah, I've gotten my fair share of, are you sure this is how you want this passage here? from different musicians over the years, for sure.
Yeah.
It's very helpful. It's very helpful to have their input. You know, I'm not a flautist, so I don't understand the instrument the way they do.
Right, exactly. And I think that adds a dimensionality to it, to the playing. That's part of what adds the dimensionality to the recording is the additional input that they provide, that the musicians themselves provide.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ryan, I was going to ask, so you mentioned like if you only had a budget for 3 or 4 musicians, do you have certain go-to instruments that you would always, I mean, it obviously probably depends on your score, but are there some instruments that you're like, we got to have that one live, sample won't do?
Yeah, guitar. Guitar samples are not great. If it's just a chord strum, you can get away with it. But it's one of the reasons why I always play guitar on anything that needs guitar. I can play guitar, rhythm at least. It's almost impossible to get away with it on samples. What else? That's the one that really sticks out. Acoustic electric guitar. It's hard to pull off.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, part of the problem is that most people who are playing these instruments are playing them into a keyboard, which, of course, an 88 key keyboard is such a different interface than the 6 strings of a guitar.
Yep.
That it's really fiendishly difficult to do it. And the other thing is getting the feel right. That even if you do get some amazing samples and you're a pro guitarist, so you kind of know what to play, it's hard to get the feel right when you're playing on a keyboard instead of playing an actual.
It's a catch-22, right? If you're a pro guitarist, why not just play guitar at that point?
Yeah, right.
Why would you even try to program it on keyboard? Like the keyboard versions, the samples are for the people who can't play those instruments. And in that case, there's no excuse. You should just play it if you know how.
Right.
Well, I have a confession to make. I am a guitarist and I do play MIDI guitar sometimes, because the only reason, if there's like 1 or 2 notes, I just need like a ding, like a nice rung out sound. They are like recorded perfectly on the sample. So
I will say this, I will use samples that are like affected guitar beds or soundscapes or whatever that are made using guitar as a sound source, but those are generally creative in their own way. And yes, I could plug in my guitar and put a million effects on it and stuff to get that sound, but they're already done. So for single note stuff or whatever, it might be faster. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, especially for drums, because it's so even if you are a live drummer, the hassle of setting up drums to record them properly, when there's so many great libraries that already are perfectly recorded,
not to mention loops. When you get into drums, you have loops too. So there's
there's a lot of live drumming available that's much more useful because it doesn't contain harmonic content.
I hire drummers relatively often for song stuff. I just think, they bring, again, it's like how you said earlier, they bring a perspective to the track that maybe I hadn't thought about using this drum pattern in this section, or they go, oh, you know what, it might sound cool to go halftime here in the verse or whatever. And that kind of, I really value that for a live song situation. So I'll often hire a drummer, but you're right. It takes a long time to set up to record drums if you're not already set up.
So talking about like efficiency in your process, I'm curious for each of you, how long does it take you to write an episode and record it, or for Robert's case, orchestrate a feature film?
Well, I have to say my mouth dropped, Ryan, when you said you get the animatic 6 months ahead of time.
I know. I'm very lucky. Most people don't. It's an animation related exception for sure. Yeah,
it's definitely. And I have done some animation, and it is great to have it that far ahead of time. In fact, I've actually scored a lot of films that have had animatics instead of special effects.
Sure.
In fact, I remember one particular film we never actually got anything more than the description of what was happening before we actually scored it.
Wow.
So, did what we could, and then it was up to the music editor to really go on it up. But sometimes especially these days, because films are so full of special effects, at least a lot of the big action films that I work on, like the Fast and Furious movies. I feel like there's so many massive amounts of the film are computer generated, and so we just don't see it. Sometimes a lot of times we get some kind of animatic, but a lot of times it's just a description.
And when do you usually start? Like, when do you start getting music to start orchestrating with regards to when the film is released or when you mix?
Right. Well, I would say in general, the cues start to dribble out in general 2 to 3 weeks before we start to record. But a lot of times a score will be released to the orchestrators piecemeal as the cues are approved by the director. So sometimes they'll get a head start, and they have a really good work ethic, and they're working with a really great director who really knows what they want and can sign off on things quickly. And then you get enough time to really sort of take your time with what you're doing, and also not have to bring in 50 other orchestrators to get everything done. But what really comes down to at the end is when directors want to make changes at the last minute. And of course, a director will hear a mock-up and see the composer sort of adjusting something. And so the director thinks that it's very easy to change something musically at, sort of toward the end of the process. And it's, the same thing with video editing. It's very easy. It's gotten very easy to edit video. But it's very difficult to actually change music, an orchestration. I mean, if you have to take out bars, then you have to tie the the bars on either side of what was cut together, and it takes quite a lot of time actually. And so we tend to not get scores until they are really locked to the film.
Nothing's ever locked these days. But.
Yeah.
days, nothing is ever lost. And directors change their mind. They'll sign off on something, and then they'll look at it again and say, no, actually, that's not, I don't like that. And it used to be in the good old days of big orchestra sessions. I mean, the good old days, I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago, before these really super accurate mock-ups were possible, that the score was really created in the studio, and the composer would write some kind of a sketch of it and play it for the director as best they could. But the director always knew that the final sign off on the score would be with the orchestra. And they play a cue, and the director says, well, you know what? I don't like the sound of that instrument, whatever that is. And then we change it in the session, and that was fine. It was time for that. But nowadays, things are completely signed off on before the orchestra ever appears, and there's often, in order to save money, there's not as much time allocated to recording the orchestra, so you have to just rip through everything, and there's not really time to change anything, and it becomes much less of a collaboration with the director.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I might get 6 months to work on something, but I don't take 6 months. I try to finish an episode. Generally I shoot for 2 to 3 minutes of music per day. And an episode of Rick and Morty has between 12 and 17 minutes of music. 17 is the exception. But so, I'll try to do an episode in a week, at least on a first pass. And then there's back and forth, of course, with Justin and Dan, notes here and there. A lot of Dan's notes are often just, this whole scene doesn't need music, pull it out, which is the easiest note in the world to address, of course. And then there's a lot of time at the very end adjusting to the final version of the episode.
Right.
And do you have advice on giving feedback to composers, like when a director's like struggling with trying to get you to hear what's in their head, I guess? Yeah.
I mean, don't use I would say, like, your best bet is to use the language that you know best, which is visual language. Because you're making a visual medium, you probably have the vocabulary to speak about things visually, and as a good composer will be able to translate that to what he or she needs to do in that situation. So go ahead and say, like, this music needs to be more pink. I probably will understand what you mean by that.
Right.
Things like that.
I think that's an excellent point, because my experience is that a lot of directors are intimidated by musicians if they're not musicians themselves. They think of musicians as they have this secret knowledge and speak this secret language and all that. And there's no reason. And as you said, Ryan, every musician who is a good composer for film is going to be equally conversant in visual and audio. Yeah,
it's our job. I mean, that's a huge part of our job description, is to translate what the director is showing and saying into music. So if you're not good at that as a composer, that's the first thing you should work on. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. If you're as a composer, and as a director, you should feel not intimidated at all. I mean, I think a lot of great stuff is just simply, you were talking about emotions, or talking about character, or talking about things that have nothing to do with music at all. And in fact, a lot of times a little knowledge could be a dangerous thing. Sometimes when a director knows a little bit about music, and so he'll say, well, I want that to be on flute, without really understanding what that means, and then you're kind of stuck, because flute, and it sounds terrible, but
I'd rather you tell me what you don't want it on than what you do want.
That's a good point that you made earlier too.
Yeah,
what you don't want is far more important than knowing what you want.
Yeah, sometimes.
So we have a related audience question, and they're wondering if it helps to give YouTube samples, or does that just pigeonhole you?
I love reference material. The more, the better. A lot of composers don't like working with temp tracks, which is the process of putting a previously recorded piece of music to your visuals as a placeholder to show the composer, okay, this is working or this isn't working. what I like about temp tracks is they open up a discussion. You can say, I like what this is doing. I just don't like this about it, or I wish it did this, or, it's a great starting off point. So absolutely, samples of music are really, really, really helpful. The only thing I would caution against as a director or a producer is do not fall in love with that temp music. Please, for the love of God, like, be open to hearing things that are inspired by that. And the more you push a composer to get closer and closer and closer to that, you have to understand that it's like, it's a legal issue. It becomes very difficult for us. At some point, it gets too close, and then we start to get nervous. And so, as long as that understanding is there, we can collaborate together and move forward together to do something inspired by what you like about this temp music.
Yeah, actually, I can talk about an example of that with one of the scores that Elliot wrote. He wrote a score for Titus, which was a movie that Julie Taymor directed, which was a great movie, but didn't get much play. And then the score was temped into 300, which was quite a big, huge movie, and a lot of people heard it. And it was one of those situations where it was Tyler Bates who was writing the score for that, and they just kept pushing him to make it sound like the temp. And finally he said, screw it, I'll just give you the temp and I'll change a few notes. And it didn't fly. He got sued, and Warner Brothers got sued, and they had to add Elliot as they had to give him composer credit. And
that's so tough. We get asked to bite each other off so often. It's really, really hard when it's like so. It must have been really close, is all I'll say to that, because how many times have you as a composer been asked to be inspired by something, right. All the time? That's a tough one.
Yeah, it's very tough. And I don't really know if it was a failure of the imagination on the director's part, or what I don't know exactly why they ended up with what they ended up, but that does happen. And of course, Stanley Kubrick is famous for loving his temp scores so much, such as in 2001: A Space Odyssey, that he just throws out the composer score without even telling him.
Yeah.
Frustrating.
Well, on that note, we're almost getting to the end of our talk, but we want to get some audience questions in. So,
Sure.
All right. What's your advice for directors who love to edit to music? Have you had work experience with directors who want to edit to the beat?
I think so. Yeah. It's usually the editors who are pulling the temp music in a lot of these situations like this. I've worked on a couple of shows where some live action, this happens a lot, where they'll edit to the temp music, to the grid or the click of the temp music. And, that's, as a composer, luckily you can't copyright a tempo. So I can use the same tempo as the temp music and hit everything they're hitting, just do it a little bit different musically and in a compositionally a different way. So yeah, I think that's fine. And if an editor wants to do that, I'm definitely, it will make my job easier, actually. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. It does make a composer's job easier. And I'll echo what you said before, Ryan, about give the composer as much information as you can, because the composer is there to sort of serve your piece, and they need to get inside your head as much as they can. So to have a temp score that the film is edited to, then as you said, that's a great place to start with the cue, is the tempo.
Yep.
And where the hits are and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Another question. Okay, Danny Elfman said, the score doesn't tell you what to feel, but that it's time to feel, or something like that. Any reaction to that, or other outlooks of your own?
I don't want to disagree with Danny Elfman, but I'm sort of tempted to, I wonder what the context of that quote was.
Yeah.
It is, I guess maybe the context was when he was saying that is that you don't always have to have music Some of the things we work on, is wall-to-wall music. And yeah, the music, sometimes the music isn't telling you to feel anything in particular in that moment. And other times when we're more judicious, Rick and Morty doesn't have wall-to-wall music. We are more judicious about when we bring it in. I guess in that sense, the music is saying, hey, it's time to feel something. There's music here, but it's also telling you what to feel. Absolutely. That's a big part of my discussion with the showrunners or the director is, what should the music be making me feel here? What's the character's point of view? How is the character feeling? Which character's emotion should I key in on with the music? If there's a villain and a hero, should I be scoring the hero's emotion or the villain's emotion in this scene? That I think telling you what to feel, it is important. But maybe when to feel is the first question you should ask. And then once you've determined that, maybe then you go to what to feel. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think he's basically talking about where should you spot music in a film, basically.
Yeah.
There have been situations where they'll argue for hours or days or even, till the film is released about when a piece of music comes in, and whether it's appropriate under a scene or whether it's not appropriate. One of the things that's been interesting has been that you have, on the one hand, you have the composer who of course wants to score everything and thinks that all is needed, as I showed in that clip. All you need is to hear the score. You don't need to hear a fireball explode, right? But at the same time, the sound effects people are doing their damnedest to make the sound effects as amazing and hyper realistic and as just as important. And then on the same time, you have a music supervisor who wants to jam as many songs in there as they can, assuming they have a sufficient budget to license songs. I've had lots of situations where you're at the dub and there's just big arguments about the composer is fighting for his score, the sound effects is fighting for their sound effects, the music supervisor is fighting for the song. It's a very interesting, sometimes political process, actually.
Yeah. Well, we have a few more questions we'll try to get to here real quick. With more young composers utilizing sample libraries, what do you think the future holds for using live orchestration? Yeah. That's
as much as I'd love to see a lice orchestra.
Yeah,
there it is. Yeah, live orchestration performers versus samples.
Yeah. This is a good question. I think there will always be a place for live orchestras in film, especially in features. They just sound better. I mean, is it possible that samples will eclipse live orchestras? No, because they're recordings of live orchestras. They're always going to be limited compared to what a live orchestra can do. I think that it's a pendulum, right? Certain people like John Williams will always stay on the live orchestra side. People like Hans Zimmer, that's the zeitgeist right now, using sample libraries, using cool effects and weird stuff like that. Will it swing back? I think so, probably. Yeah,
Yeah, in fact, it was the case back in the early 60s, late 60s and the early 70s, when films like The Graduate came out, which was all Simon and Garfunkel songs. And all of a sudden, an orchestra sounded completely old-fashioned, and absolutely, kind of what a live orchestra sounds like today, frankly. And people stopped using orchestras. And John Williams, when he wrote the score probably first to Jaws, which was a year before Star Wars, and then to Star Wars, or a couple of years. But Star Wars definitely made it. Just blasted the orchestra back into existence, and then it became impossible to do a big summer blockbuster without a big giant orchestra score. And now, the pendulum has kind of swung back more toward synthesized or non-orchestral.
Yeah. Well, it's, hybrid. The hybrid sound is really popular right now, where you've got synthesizers and orchestral. In the 80s, a lot of music scores were done using all synthesizers,
Oh yeah, Tron.
Beverly Hills Cop, Tron. Yeah, lots of cool 80s scores that are all synthesizers, especially horror movies too.
Right. And that sort of coincided with the golden age of synthesizers,
Right.
when the golden age of sound design, I guess, where there were all these cool new sounds that you could use. And the DX7 was, when that came out, the Yamaha DX7 keyboard, which was you heard it on all over the radio.
Yeah.
Couldn't avoid it because
movies everywhere. Yeah,
movies and everywhere, because it was such a great. So I think there's a certain trendiness, I guess, that comes with the sound of an orchestra. Having said that, I am personally amazed. I think that if the orchestra was doomed, then I think composers would have been replaced with library music, years ago. I mean, the fact that anybody even commissions a composer to write what sometimes basically turns out to be a library score is amazing to me. There's a lot of value placed on creativity, on live creativity and live interaction with the screen. And I think, like you said, the orchestra is always going to be a part of that. Even if 90%, if you could probably play the score to, say, Inception, or one of Hans Zimmer's scores that had used a lot of synths, and you could probably play the mock-up and then the actual score, and many people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference, but you would be able to feel the difference, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of what music is meant to do.
You guys up for one last question?
Sure.
Sneak it in.
Yeah, I got all day.
All right. Let's hear it. Ooh, what do you think of Zoom orchestras for social distancing?
Is it possible? The delay is so bad. I don't think you could perform together, right? It's
not possible to do it together. The only time I've ever seen it has been each part pre-recorded to a click and then put together.
Yeah.
I think
the Minnesota Orchestra recently did that, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah, with Skeleton Key. Yeah, I think it actually, and I have to say, Andy Thompson, who produced that recording, did an amazing job of making it sound great. But
if people were watching this series, they would have seen Andy on the first of these 3 music talks. So yeah, he was fun to talk to about that.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Yeah, it's basically, the problem is the infrastructure of the internet. We just don't have fast internet in this country. Everywhere. So there's a lag. Even if everybody had, I guess, the fastest internet possible, I would suspect there would still be lag, issues and sync issues.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing I wanted to say about Zoom orchestras in general is the idea of watching people play on a recording versus listening to them play live. And I think I have the sense that as soon as we are allowed to fill up concert halls and venues again, we will. I think people are dying to hear music played as it was sort of, especially classical music anyway. Especially, classical music was written way before there was anything that resembled recording. It was written to be heard acoustically. All these instruments interacting with each other acoustically in real time, which is one of the things that sample libraries also can't really do very well.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you guys so much for being here. It's
Absolutely.
fascinating hearing from you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
So.
Sure.
All right.